Billy. Lieutenant Cohen.
So, you seem to know me. Been fantasizing about me, have you?
You're the prisoner that was being transferred for execution. You were with those soldiers outside.
Oh, I see. You're with stars. Well, no offense, honey, but your kind doesn't seem to want me around, so I'm afraid our little chat time is over.
Wait! You're under arrest!
No thanks, Dollface. I've already worn handcuffs.
I could shoot, you know. Edward! Are you alright? What happened?
It's worse than... We can't. You must be careful, Rebecca. The forest is full of zombies and monsters.
Zombies and monsters.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Backlogged, and for this episode it was kind of a struggle for me to pick what game that I wanted to play. There has been one game that I've wanted to do for a while. This version of the game hasn't been in my backlog for a long time, but this game in particular has been in my backlog for, 15 years now. And that game, and the game that this episode is about, is Resident Evil 0. It should come to no one's surprise on this channel that there are two main game franchises that I'm a huge diehard fan of. One of those is Castlevania, the other is Resident Evil. I actually actively, up until like 2 years ago, I tell people that my favorite game of all time is Resident Evil, specifically the GameCube remake version of it. Resident Evil 0 is a game that's always been on my backlog because I just couldn't get into it. It's much different than Resident Evil, the original, and Resident Evil 2, 3, Code Veronica, all that. And part of that reason, there are two main reasons why I can never get into this game back in the day, and we'll dive into that in today's episode. Resident Evil 0 was released on November 12th, 2002. It was originally released only on the GameCube as part of Nintendo's 3-game exclusivity deal with Capcom. So this was the second game in that deal, the first game being the Resident Evil GameCube remake, and then eventually Resident Evil 4, which came out in January of 2005 here in the States. But then the game, obviously, the exclusivity deal kind of, crumbled, and the game came out on other platforms like Wii, and eventually in 2016, which the footage that you'll see today is from the PS4 version of Resident Evil 0, but it was re-released and remastered for PS4, Xbox One, PC. You can even get it on PS3 and 360 if you really want to. The remaster was also re-released in a 2-pack collection for PS4 and Xbox One called the Resident Evil Origins Collection. It's a fantastic edition. That's actually the version of the game that I have. I actually bought this. And the weird thing for me in Resident Evil, and this has always been the weird thing for me in Resident Evil, is for Resident Evil being it is my favorite game of all time, I'll always buy it and play it on all platforms. I own it for the GameCube, I own it for the original Wii, I own it for PS4, obviously in that version I just showed. I bought it digitally for the Xbox One when it first came out, because it was only digital when that version first came out, and then I also did recently buy it for PC, so I own that game on every platform. But for me, the black sheep of this franchise has always been Resident Evil 0. It is the one and only Resident Evil game that I've never finished. I never have been able to do it. And I will say at the time of recording this video, I have not finished it, but I'm actually sitting down and enjoying my playthrough of it more than I ever have, and I'm giving the game more of a chance than I ever have as well. So what is Resident Evil 0 then? Resident Evil 0 is a prequel to the original game covering the ordeals experienced in the Arklay Mountains by the police force STARS Bravo team. They're the Bravo team now. The tale follows Rebecca Chambers and the convicted criminal Billy Cohen, somebody who I've always thought is like the worst Resident Evil protagonist, and I still think he's one of the worst Resident Evil protagonists. Like, I have an active dislike for that character. As they explore the abandoned training facility for employees at the Umbrella Corporation. Resident Evil 0 follows the same formula as the previous Resident Evil games. However, there's a unique partner zapping mechanic that has never been used in any other Resident Evil game. It was kind of only done in this one. You can even control both characters at once, but you switch between both of them. So once you meet Billy Cohen after like the first half hour in the game, you can switch between them and each have different abilities. So for example, Billy Cohen can push large objects when Rebecca Chambers can't. However, Rebecca Chambers has the ability to mix herbs in the game. Billy does not. It works really well in this game, but it was never used ever again. The other main thing, and that was one of the two things I kind of dislike in this game. Like, it's okay, but it pales in comparison to the second reason, and the reason I always have had such a strong dislike of Resident Evil 0, and why I still actively think it is the black sheep of Resident Evil games to this day, is the fact that there is no item box. They completely abandoned the item box for a system in which you can just drop items in whatever room you're in, but because of the limited memory hardware on the GameCube, you can only drop a maximum number of, I don't even know, but it's not a lot of items in one room, and you have to kind of spread them around. The problem with this is, yes, it does make the game harder because there's not an item box that's linked everywhere in the game, kind of like the original Resident Evil, which is definitely a lifesaver for a lot of reasons. But also the other reason here is that it feels cheap. It feels like an artificial way to make this game more challenging than it has to be. An interesting thing about this game, so Resident Evil 0 was originally, development started on the Nintendo 64, but the cartridge limitations was too much for the company, and they kind of shifted focus when Nintendo was like, hey, we're making a new system. They shifted focus. So this game was always on the burner of, being made, and the Resident Evil remake was kind of like a thing that they made to make this engine and see if it works. So they began production of Resident Evil 0, and then what they did was they ported up Resident Evil from the PS1, the old version, into this new engine. And that game actually came out first. If I remember, it came out May 1st, 2002. I remember because it's the reason I bought a GameCube. And the main reason for me hating this item box thing so much is it was proven that it was an experiment in this game, and they never did it in any other Resident Evil game. And that's why I stick strongly behind it was a mistake to do that, and thusly this game suffered for that reason. And for that reason alone, it's why I've never finished Resident Evil 0. For this playthrough that I started to do this backlogged and pulling it off my shelf, I'm actually going to sit down and finish this game for the first time. I've never finished it. It's always been in the back of my mind. It's always been a thing where I've sat and I've, it eats away at me sometimes. Like, you should really play Resident Evil 0. Because it's the only Resident Evil, such and such. And I never finished Resident Evil Survivor, but that game is unfinishable, so that's different. But Resident Evil 0, I've never finished it, and this will be the first time that I do. That's part of the reason I started Backlogged here, is to play games that have been sitting on my shelf for way too long. So I really like this game more than I thought I would coming back to it, for sure. I'm a huge fan of tank controls in the Resident Evil series. For me, I love every single iteration of Resident Evil for their own reasons. I even like 6. People really hate Resident Evil 6. I think that game's hatred is blown wildly out of proportion. But I like every Resident Evil for its own unique thing. And Resident Evil 0 is the only one that I've always looked at and been like, because I also don't care. Like, Rebecca Chambers is a cool character, don't get me wrong. I don't have any hatred for her, but Billy Cohen is such a shitty character. Even playing through it now, 15 years later, still, I don't think he's a great character. But I'm anxious to get through this game, actually finally see it to the end. I mean, I know from reading on Wikipedia and stuff a long time ago, like, what the overall story of Resident Evil 0 is and what it adds to this franchise, but I've never actually finished it, which is kind of shameful for me being such a huge Resident Evil fan, that it's the only Resident Evil I've never finished. But hence the point of Backlog. So, but I really like this game. I like the lighting. Everything about it is just so cool, and it looks so good today, 15 years later. Those pre-rendered backgrounds that they used for both Resident Evil 0 and the remake, they just look gorgeous still to this day, and they really hold their own. It's weird because it was always a thing. My best friend and I, almost every year, at some point in the year, we sit down and we play through Resident Evil together. It's also one of his favorite games of all time. For a long time, that was the GameCube version of the game. And we always said to each other, like, it'd be really cool if they remastered it. I just don't see it happening. Because it had this Nintendo exclusivity thing, I never thought that it was going to happen. I always assumed, like, oh, they'll never do it because Capcom had that deal with Nintendo. And what's really bizarre about the whole situation is that they remastered it and they put it out on every platform but a Nintendo platform. They didn't put it on Wii U, which is weird because Resident Evil Revelations is on the Wii U. But they did not put this game out on the Wii U, and as of this recording, they have not put it on the Switch either. I think if they really wanted to, you could put Resident Evil and you could put Resident Evil 0 on the Switch, and they'd be fantastic ports of the game. I'd actually be all for having a portable version of the original Resident Evil. I would play that all the time. But every year, my buddy and I will sit and we'll do a playthrough, sometimes even 2 playthroughs of the original Resident Evil, and for a long time that was the GameCube one. It was the kind of thing where we dust off his GameCube and load it up, and we do that. And then when this finally got announced, I was super excited. I got all the achievements in the Xbox version. I got the Platinum Trophy in the PlayStation version. The only version of the original Resident Evil that I haven't gotten everything done in is the PC version, and maybe I'll do that someday. But for Resident Evil 0, it's just always sat there. Even he and I sat down and tried several times over the last decade to play Resident Evil 0, and he's the same way as I am, where it's just, could never get into it because of those reasons. And every time, we'd sit down and play, like, this is cool, but I'd rather just go play Resident Evil Remake instead. And then obviously this version came out, so. But like, everything else about it, like, the graphics still look phenomenal to this day, even remastered. They did try to fix tank controls for people that don't like tank controls. I'm a weirdo that not only likes the tank controls, I actually play the game with the D-pad, which people have told me is crazy that I play the way, but that's just how I learned how to play those games back in the day, so that's how I've always enjoyed it. Everything about this specific package is fantastic. So if you've never, honestly, if you've never played a Resident Evil game, I strongly encourage you to pick this up. It is fantastic. It is a much different kind of game than what you would play today, for sure. I don't think we're ever going to get another Resident Evil like these games. So, and it is also exciting this year we're going to get a Resident Evil 2 remake. They announced that 2 years ago now. So and now that Resident Evil 7's out, done and dusted essentially, I think at E3 this year you will have a blowout for Resident Evil 2 remake. And I cannot wait for that. That is probably, Resident Evil, the original, is my favorite game of all time. Resident Evil 2 is probably, I'd argue it's my third favorite, because Resident Evil 5 is my second favorite Resident Evil, which is also hypocrisy to a lot of Resident Evil fans. I don't know why. I like that game's co-op is phenomenal. So, anyways, guys, I love Resident Evil through and through. I'm enjoying my time with Resident Evil 0 for the first time in 15 years. I strongly recommend, if you've never played a single Resident Evil game, go pick up that collection. You can find it, like, usually you can find it for, I think I've seen it as cheap as $25. You can get it between $25 and $30 right now. Definitely worth it. I think each game is more than worth $15, a pop for it. But Resident Evil 0, just keep in mind, it has its quirks, and I'm someone who's had a hard time getting through the quirks of Resident Evil 0, but I actually am going to finish it for the first time this time. But if you've never played Resident Evil, I highly recommend you go and you pick up that collection. You can even download the original Resident Evil for fairly cheap on either the Xbox Store or the PlayStation Store as well. But it is a fantastic, phenomenal game. It's an experience that no one should miss. But anyways, guys, until next time.